managed to change it. Yeah, so this was the work done by Robbe, who couldn't be here. He's a master student, the computer science degree at KU Leuven, and he did this as his own master's thesis, so I'm going to present it. All right, so as the title says, you're probably familiar with the concept of distractors in locomotion scenarios in VR. So one of those first works was the Distractor by Peck et al. Presented, now 10 years ago, in which they used distractors such as a hummingbird to distract the user and try to rotate them in order to allow them to continue walking. Now, this is a problem especially relevant to locomotion scenarios in which the physical space is more limited than the virtual space depicted by the user. So at some point they are going to hit the wall if nothing is done. So the distractor appears in such scenarios, in such circumstances, and tries to catch the attention of the user and try to steer them towards, in order to allow them to continue working. And in more recent times, this has been further explored in other works. For example, the work V-Motion by Mishra Shra, in which they used some features of the virtual environments in order to apply the redirection. For example, in one of the examples, as you can see, there was this kind of binocular here, and when the users were looking at them, then the scenario changed orientation. And then in the other work by Chen and Fuchs in 2017, they used a dragon distractor, which you can see there, and the user had a water gun with which they could shoot at the distractor in order to make it go away, and in that way apply the redirection effect. So in our work, we wanted to more deeply explore the role of interactivity in distractors, so we implemented three different types of distractors, from less interactive to more interactive. So they are called in this way. One was the looking distractor, the touching distractor, and the third one was a color matching game. So to look at them, so this is the scenario in which the experiment took place. And so at some point, this sphere appears, and the users are required to look at it. And while they look at the distractor, the user is subtly redirected until they are allowed to walk again. So our argument requires that users were looking at them, but we didn't use an eye tracking system. So the forward direction of the user's camera is used to estimate the looking direction. And so the task consisted in requiring them to walk for 30 meters until they reached the goal at the end. With the touching distractor, it's similar, but users were required to actually collide their controller with the distractor when it light up, and they couldn't even ignore it, but this required them to engage with the distractor, and they did so. And then when it disappears, it allows them to walk, to continue walking again. And the final distractor consisted in playing a color match game. So as you can see in the interface on the controller were displayed 4 colors, and as you can imagine, when the distractor appeared, the central light switched on with the color they needed to press in order to continue the process. If they at any time stopped interacting or looked away, then the distractor would freeze in place, and no more redirection would happen. The algorithm works in the way as displayed by the diagram. So there was a safe area in which they could walk, which was quite small because we used a room scale scenario with our HTC Vive. And so when they were within this safe area, they could walk freely, and when they crossed out of that area, then the distractor would appear. And while it was appearing, then the rotation of the tracking origin was applied. So from an overhead perspective, this is what it looks like. So this is the overhead view of the virtual environment, and the user is the circle there, and the distractor is the this thing here. And so you can see that, for example, they were continuously reoriented until the origin, the tracking origin, was rotated and allowed them to continue walking. In order to perform an evaluation of this of these three distractors, we implemented another one which was based on discrete reorientation, meaning that when the distractor appeared and the users collided the controller with it, they would instantly be virtually rotated 180 degrees. So after physically turning, then they could continue walking in the direction of the goal. And as you can see here is what was happening. You can imagine what happens to the tracking space when after they collide. So for our user study, we followed the following procedure. We had 23 participants, 7 of which were female, and the task consisted in reaching the target, which was at 30 meters of distance from the position in which they started. And as I've said, this happened in an area of 4 meters by 4 meters. And the apparatus consisted of a Vive headset that we coupled with a wireless add-on in order to free them from the cables. In terms of metrics, we measure the position, both real and virtual, and the deviation from the optimal path, and the time that it took to complete the task. We also had various questionnaires, such as the presence, later you saw STEED questionnaire, Kennedy's simulator sickness questionnaire, and then a custom one of other questions, depending on, for example, with asking users to see whether they noticed the redirection and so on. In terms of results, as you can imagine, the discrete reorientation was significantly faster than the other one, because as you have seen from the video, it happened instantaneously. And whereas the interactive or the continuous distractors took much longer. But what's interesting about this will come up next. First, I will also present the other results for the questionnaire. So there were no difference in terms of simulator sickness or in terms of presence. What was interesting about these results was the noticeability, which we gathered from the questionnaire that we asked. So the discrete distractor was the most noticeable of the techniques that were presented to them. And although the results, the pairwise comparison were not significant, we can see that there is a trend towards having more complex interaction, leading to lower noticeability. Also, in terms of time and distance estimation. So as I mentioned, we had users describe, according to them, to give an estimate of how long it took to complete the task. And we saw that what our users said in terms of the time that it took to complete the task for the discrete reorientation technique, which was the one that called stop and reset, they expressed that they estimated it to last 3 times as longer than it actually did. So the numbers are there in minutes. Whereas for the interactive distractors, there was still an overestimation, but it was much smaller, so 50% larger instead of 300%. Also, preference, we asked to indicate what kind of locomotion technique they preferred, and we saw that the looking technique was the least preferred, and the stop and reset was also the second least technique. And they had, although non-significant, a higher preference for the more interactive techniques. So, in terms of positive implication that we found from this study, we saw that having interactive distractors could lead to decreased noticeability, and it improved the user experience. And also, as we noticed by talking with by interviewing them at the end of the experiment, most of them mentioned the idea that it decreases the feeling of walking back and forth, and also they mentioned that the area felt larger than it was actually. In terms of negatives, so it increases the walking times, and also it's highly dependent on the design of the virtual environment. What we didn't look at was about the prolonged uses of distractors, because in this experiment they happened quite frequently. And if we imagine in a practical scenario, which, for example, in a game or in a scenario in which users need to explore a larger area, then this could happen quite often, and this could lead to frustrations. So in terms of future direction, we feel it's important to study noticeability thresholds when interacting, both in terms of redirection and also in terms of virtual environment manipulation. So for the first, we mean that to try and study larger gain values, for example, and also to see whether it is possible to manipulate the virtual environment while the actual layout of the virtual environment when the users is actually focused on the interacting. As we saw, this could be a potential option to explore. And also, in order to maintain a more general applicability of these distractors, it's also very important to look at how we can generalize and apply these distractors in other contexts. As you saw, the sphere was somehow contextually appropriate to the virtual environment. It had a futuristic look, and the environment was also futuristic in some sense. But this probably will not work in a more urban environment, more contemporary environment, or in open locations, in indoor location. So, for example, we need to see if these mechanisms, like the way, for example, the concept of touching the distractor could be applied in another scenario. For example, in an urban environment, this could be a person that hands out flyers, and then the touching distractor could be adapted to you touching the flyer in order to take it, and this would reuse the metaphor of touching. Whereas the color game could be a combination, like a handshake with another person, and so on. But we feel that the general ideas could work in other scenarios. All right. So it was a bit shorter, but yeah. Thanks again for listening. If you have any questions. Hi.
So one of the things that struck me, thank you. One of the things that struck me about the video was that the distractor moves pretty slowly around the user's head, and the speed of the distractor is also going to interact with the rotation gain threshold that you're applying, and the level to which you can apply redirection without them noticing. So my question is just, how did you determine those parameters in the design of your experiment?
Yeah, that will be a question for him. You can see the email. I'm not entirely sure about what happened and how the values were actually chosen. I must guess it was chosen after prototyping and pilot testing, and then he chose those values for the techniques. You can say, as you said, they could be faster, and perhaps that's something that would be useful to look at and see what kind of differences there are if the sphere was faster or even slower.
Do you happen to know if just the rotation gain thresholds were chosen out of the literature, or were they also empirically determined?
Again, I think it was due to pilot testing.
So I'm interested in, have you ever tried using distractors in non-orientable spaces, or spaces that are a lot more confusing? Because this one is, you actually have significant landmarks. What happens if you're using a distractor where there are no landmarks in the virtual environment, or less of landmarks? What are the consequences?
I think the algorithm will work just fine in redirecting users towards areas in which they want to know. But it could be in such a small space. It could also be necessary to have some indication where the user wants to go in order to provide the most appropriate redirection. But we are also looking at other ways in which this can be coupled with other techniques, such as manipulating the environment, for example, and assumed on the direction in which the user is traveling. Yeah.
I have a couple, but following up on that one, because I don't work in this area, I don't know if anybody in the audience knows, or you could answer, do people look in terms of those thresholds as a function of like what's expected in terms of the visual flow fields for that person in that environment at that moment, so dynamically adjusting depending on distances, complexity, spectral, the frequency content of the things in the scene? Does anybody do that, do you know?
I think there are various papers on understanding in more detail the thresholds of redirection. One famous paper by Frank Steinig some couple of years ago, which went further in this. These values were constant in our case, but it could make sense to make them adaptive depending on what's going on.
And then I have a more specific question to you if no one else has a question. Do you know, if I understood this correctly, people preferred the method that sort of interfered with what they were doing more?
Yeah.
That seems paradoxical to me. Do you know why? Do you have insight into that?
I think it gave them something else to do. No? They were playing some sort of mini game, and that kept users engaged in trying to do this. Which, since it introduced also a little bit of variability, which might be important. So it was different each time, perhaps. And whereas the others, they were non-interactive. They required just to look at them or to do something that's more repetitive. But of course, this will increase the time it takes to traverse the environment because of the added actions that the user is going to do.
Okay, Adalberto, thank you so very much. Thank you again.
Yeah.
And Suzanne?